Hello and welcome to this discussion on weeding in the library using the CREW method. So starting with general impressions, what I did for this project is I ran a title-wise analysis of our school library collection in Tidal Wave. So this is the school that I currently work at where my librarian is my mentor. It tells us that we have over 20,000 books in our collection, breaks it down by fiction and nonfiction, and also helps us to see the average age of titles by section. And you can see this red number here. We have 35% of our titles are considered aged titles. So I started with that number and I click here for age sensitive areas. And so we have a lot of red numbers here, a lot of alerts that in these age sensitive areas where you're frequently seeing more up to date information and outdated information that needs to go, we definitely have a need for weeding in these areas. Because I teach AP government currently, I decided to start with the political science section. So when I click here on political science, it takes me to those 85 items that are aged titles. And that's where I started my weeding process. So the criteria for weeding, according to the CREW manual published by the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, for the political science section, the criteria is 5-3 musty. The 5 is years since publication. The 3 is years since last circulation. And musty stands for misleading, ugly, superseded, trivial, irrelevant, or can be obtained elsewhere. So these are the criteria that I kept in mind while looking through these 85 aged titles to see what should be taken out, what should be weeded. Additional criteria that the CREW manual offers for the political science section is that weeding within 5 years of publication is especially relevant to current political topics. You want to make sure that you don't have irrelevant political topics in your selection. General guidelines on processes and systems, however, may be kept longer. So if you have books that are about democracy in general, those could be kept longer as long as they're still relevant. Local political history may be kept indefinitely, and you want to weed books on past presidential elections if the issues are no longer relevant. You also want to be aware of changes in political rhetoric, how these books interrelate with other areas. So you might want to cross-reference with your history section, for example, and books that discuss countries that no longer exist. Those definitely should be weeded, unless they're in the history section. So what needs to go in our current library? There were a couple of books that really stuck out to me on this list of 85 aged titles. Some books of influential world leaders that were published over a decade ago, a book on children's rights that was published over 15 years ago that definitely probably has been updated since. We have 2 copies of A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from Homeless Shelter to Ivy League, which might still be a relevant book for our population, but we don't need 2 copies, so at least one of these could definitely go. A book about why Americans vote the way they do that was published in 2010. In the last decade, we've definitely had some changes in that, so that could go. A book on the Voting Rights Act, published over a decade ago, and I know for a fact that the Supreme Court has made rulings since then that have struck down provisions of the Voting Rights Act, so that definitely could go. A book about the 2012 election that is dated could go. A book about presidential races throughout history. The last presidential race covered in this book is 2004, so I think we probably could find something more up to date, so that one could go. Another book about the 2008 election. Now, while I definitely recognize that the election of Barack Obama is a significant election, I would want to cross-reference our history section for this one. If we don't have a book in our history section, or if we don't have a more up-to-date book on Barack Obama's election, then I might consider keeping this book. But I would imagine that we have something else in our history section that so that I could weed this book. And then another book on U.S. foreign policy published in 2011, which we definitely have changed our foreign policy a bit since then. So this is something that could go. The other thing that I noticed when analyzing this section is that of these aged titles, almost 12% of them are biographies on Martin Luther King. So while I definitely believe that Martin Luther King Jr. is significant in our history, again, I would want to cross-reference with our history section. I would want to look at our most recent titles. And I would also want to see, even if we do keep some of these titles about Martin Luther King Jr., I would want to narrow down our selection of biographies on this guy because I'm sure that some of these books are superseded by better editions. So, final question: has this section been weeded effectively? Probably not in a while. I love this project because I am now really interested in talking to my mentor about her weeding process. We haven't had that discussion yet. And so I'm interested to know whether she weeds every year or certain sections in certain years. And so this is definitely going to spark great conversations. Thanks.